All right, so just to remind you, a supply curve is upward sloping because supply is, the law of supply says that there's a positive relationship between price and quantity. So we have an upward sloping curve here for supply. And so now we're going to look at each one of these variables that is not price or quantity. Now you might say, well, I see price right there. That's not, or you said it was a third variable, not price. Yeah, but here's what you have to understand is this one is prices of factors of production in other markets, not this product market. I want to remind you that businesses purchase factors of production from other businesses. And so the factors of production that they purchase affect their ability to sell products, certain quantities at certain prices. And so that's why we have prices of factors of production up here. Okay? So let's go ahead and go through these determinants of supply and see how they affect the supply curve, see how they affect supply and ultimately the supply curve. So production costs is probably the most important one because all of these others, for the most part, filter their way through production costs. And so if we look at how costs affect supply, we can automatically then understand how all of these other things affect supply. So let's say we have two situations. We can either have an increase in production costs, or we can have a decrease in production costs. Now, what is a production cost? Well, it's pretty much all of the costs, all of the, let's say in particular, mostly it's the explicit costs that affect a business. But all of the costs that affect a business are ultimately production costs. So the idea here is when the cost of production goes up, here's what that means. Let's say that you're a business. Let's say that you have, I don't know, $10,000 to make a bunch of stuff. If it costs you more to make something that you used to make, let's say you used to make them for $1 a piece. So you could make 10,000 of them because you have $10,000. But now they cost $2 a piece to produce. How many can you produce? You can produce 5,000 because $2 times 5,000 is the $10,000 you have. So the idea here is as the cost of production goes up, you can't produce as much stuff. The amount that you can produce goes down. And the amount that you can produce effectively is your supply of whatever it is that you're making. And so an increase in production costs means that you can't make as much stuff. So you are going to have a decrease in supply. On the other hand, if your production costs go down, if the cost of producing a unit goes down to 50 cents a piece, now you can produce 20,000 of them because you have $10,000. And therefore, a decrease in production costs will result in an increase in supply. So when production costs go up, the result is a decrease in supply and a leftward shift of the supply curve. Okay? So an increase when it costs more to do business, when costs go up, you can't do as much business. On the other hand, if production costs go down, this is a very good situation. If production costs go down, then supply goes up because you can produce more, because you can do more with the money you have. And an increase in supply is going to be a rightward shift of the supply curve. And so a decrease in production costs results in a rightward shift of the supply curve. Okay? All right. Now let's move on to understanding this. Now we can actually, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to put this on the side, this production costs, because here's what we're going to do is we're going to filter all of these things through production costs. So over here, I'm going to say that an increase in production costs leads to a decrease in supply, but a decrease in production costs leads to an increase in supply. All right? So now let's talk about prices of factors of production. So prices of factors. Now, we've got land, labor, and capital. Now, I want to do these kind of separately because land and capital, I've mentioned this before, they behave more like products, where labor behaves a little bit differently. Now, it's going to work the same. The prices of factors of production, it's going to work the same. It's going to have the same effect on supply. But here's the reason I'm splitting them out, is because I want to make sure that you learn the word wages. And wages is very specifically goes with labor. Okay? And so here's what we're going to say. Let's do land and capital first, and then we'll go to wages. That when the price of any factor of production, what's an example of a factor of production? Well, I used to work for a company that would refill toner cartridges for printers. And one of the most important parts on a toner cartridge is called the drum. And we would get these boxes and boxes of drums so that when we remanufacture the cartridges, we might have to take out the old drum and put in a new drum. So we would buy these drums from a supplier that sold lots of supplies for printing. And one of them was drums. And so we'd get like 17 boxes of drums in and have them all sitting on the shelf. Well, if the price of those drums, that's capital. Those drums, that's a supply, but it's manufactured, it's capital. If the price of drums goes up, what does that mean for our production costs? Well, it means our production costs are going to go up. So, if we have an increase in factor prices, and it doesn't have to be, a factor price could be land, could be our natural resources. Let's say that we are supplied with iron ore, and if the price of iron ore goes up, well, how's that going to affect our production costs? Well, that's going to result in an increase in production costs. And an increase in production costs means a decrease in supply. Do you see that? So, when factor prices go up, because that causes an increase in production costs, it's going to cause a decrease in supply. So an increase in factor prices is going to cause a leftward shift of the supply curve. And we are going to be supplying less. Why? Because it costs more. We have to pay out more money for our factors of production. On the other hand, if we have a decrease in factor prices, that means that we can buy more factors of production. Being able to buy more factors of production means that our production costs have gone down. That's a decrease in production costs, and therefore will result in an increase in supply. And so, a decrease, when it's cheaper to buy our supplies, when our supplies are cheaper, we can make more stuff. And so we have an increase in supply. That's a rightward shift of the supply curve, and that is good for us because now we can make more stuff and sell more stuff. Okay? All right, let's move on to wages now. Wages basically work the same. In fact, all I have to do is I can just erase factor prices here because wages are a factor price. They are the factor price of labor resources. So, but I want to talk about wages just for a second. A lot of times students will become confused with the word wages, and they'll confuse the word wages with the word income. Now, income, you've already seen, affects demand. Wages affect supply. Now, wages and income should be equal. And the reason that they're equal is because how much the wages that an employee earns is the income that they take home. But here's the big difference. In economics, in my class, wages is what suppliers call what they pay their employees wages. Consumers or buyers, they call what they take home income. So when I say income in this class, I'm talking about consumer demand. And when I'm talking about wages, I'm talking about businesses supplying. Okay, so that's a big deal. So because we're talking about supply here and not demand, we're going to use the word wages because that's how businesses think about the money that they pay out. Businesses pay out wages, consumers and workers receive income. All right, it's important that you understand that. In fact, another way to think about it is this: if you look at the households, the circular flow diagram, and firms, right? Income, firms pay households through the labor market, right? So through the labor market, households provide labor, firms provide households with income, right? So over here, this dollar sign, that's income. But when firms pay it out over here, they call it wages. When it's a cost to them, it's called wages. When it's earned money for households, it's called income. So please remember that. And that's the main reason that I split out land and capital from labor. Also, the labor market often behaves a little differently than the land and the capital markets. Okay? All right, so here's the deal. When wages go up, when an employer has to pay more money out to their employees, that increases their production costs. They have to pay out more money for the same work. They're not getting extra work out of this. If it's just a matter of the workers working more, that's already handled on the supply curve. But this is a situation where workers are actually getting paid more. They've all gotten a raise, and now the company has to pay out higher wages than they used to. Because they're paying more out, that's an increase in production cost. An increase in production cost means a decrease in the supply curve and a leftward shift of the supply curve. On the other hand, if wages go down, if employers can pay less money out to the employees, that means that they're paying less money in costs. And a decrease in production costs is going to lead to an increase in supply. That's a rightward shift of the supply curve. Now what we're talking about, this idea of wages in the labor market, this would then be the labor market. This is the supply in the labor market in particular. This is extremely important in both microeconomics and also in macroeconomics. So be very careful to understand this idea of how wages affect supply. And then in the next lesson, we're going to learn about how it would affect quantity demanded. Okay? All right, let's go on to the next item. All right, let's talk about overhead costs. What are overhead costs? Well, in a business, overhead is all of the costs that don't directly go into the production of the thing that you're making. So, for example, the rental facility, let's say that you rent a building to do business. That's generally considered an overhead cost. Let's say advertising for trying to sell your product. That's often considered an overhead cost. Your water bill, your electrical bill, overhead costs. Your phone bill, those are overhead costs. And sometimes your product, let's say it's really cheap to get your factors of production. It's not expensive. In fact, let's say the prices of the factors have even gone down. So you can produce more than ever. But something happens in the economy that causes rent to go up or phone bills to go up. And so something that's not even related to what you produce, the costs of that thing go up and you have to be buying that thing. And therefore, that's an increase in overhead costs. And so an increase in overhead ultimately means an increase in your production costs. Because I just told you previously, right, that production costs are all of the costs associated with doing business, all of the costs associated with producing something. And in order to produce something, you're going to have water running into your building, for example, for the bathrooms so that your employees can use the restroom when they need to, or electricity so that when you pull the trigger on a drill, it starts up. Or the electricity for the computers, or advertising. You're not going to sell anything unless you advertise somehow. So an increase in overhead costs means an increase in production costs, which means a decrease in supply and a leftward shift of the supply curve. On the other hand, let's say that let's say you have a really well insulated building that doesn't really need to be heated much, it doesn't really need to be heated much. And so in the winter time, you don't have to run the air conditioning, right? And let's say that it has good heating to start with, so you're not going to pay as much electricity in the winter time. And the result of that is your overhead costs are going to go down. And that results in a decrease in production costs, and a decrease in production costs means an increase in supply. So now you can put that money towards making more stuff. And an increase in supply means a rightward shift of the supply curve. Isn't that awesome? That is good stuff. We like it when the supply curve shifts to the right. We don't like it when the supply curve shifts to the left. That's not as good. Okay, but it happens. Sometimes it's good for the economy, but it's not good for our business. All right? So that's overhead costs. What about supply shocks? What is a supply shock? Well, a supply shock is an interesting thing. When we say supply shock, think tsunami, think hurricane, think, it doesn't always have to be a natural disaster. It can be a lot of things. A stock market crash could be a supply shock, okay? A supply shock is basically a situation, supply shock. A supply shock is some sort of drastic event in the economy. It's a drastic event. In fact, let's write this out. A drastic event. In fact, it can be something good. It doesn't have to be something bad. A drastic event in the economy that greatly affects the supply of resources, or let's say resources / products. All right. So in Florida, there are a lot of hurricanes, and one of the things that happens in Florida during the hurricanes is everybody runs to Home Depot and Lowe's to buy up plywood. Why do they buy all the plywood? Because they want to put plywood over their windows and to protect their windows from flying objects, right? What I don't understand is, I don't know what because this happens over and over and over again. When the hurricane was over, did they throw out the plywood? Why didn't they just keep the plywood so that the next time there's a hurricane? Because every single time there's a hurricane, they run out of plywood. So I assume people are just throwing the plywood out. They're not keeping it. I don't know why. Maybe well, I know a little bit about plywood. You can probably keep it in your shed if you're getting the right kind of plywood. So here's the thing. Something happens and it puts the economy in a situation where it's harder to get a hold of plywood because all the plywood has been bought out. Now, how do you think the contractors feel about the fact that they can't go get plywood a week after the hurricane is over to do their regular job that they would use plywood for? Okay, that is a supply shock. And we can have two kinds of supply shocks. We can have negative supply shocks and positive supply shocks. Let's call them SS. So if we have a negative supply shock, that results in an increase. It typically results in an increase in production costs. A negative supply shock makes it more expensive to do business because let's say you really need to get some plywood. Well, you'll pay extra money to get the plywood. And ultimately what that's really doing is it's causing an increase in the price of a factor of production. So a lot of times these supply shocks work through some of these other things. Something else, let's say that that hurricane knocked out the electricity and keeping things cold in your business is important. Well, now you're going to have to get a generator and run the generator and pour gasoline or diesel into the generator so that you can keep your refrigerators going so all your product doesn't get destroyed or doesn't thaw out. Okay? So that would be a negative supply shock. A positive supply shock is something that happens that actually winds up being good for you. For example, the plywood companies probably do pretty well during a hurricane, right? Everybody wants their stuff. So they have an increase in supply. So this is a positive supply shock is going to result in, well, it won't always result, but let's just say that it results in a decrease in production costs. Oftentimes the reason it results in a decrease in production costs is because the positive supply shock makes these factors of production more favorable for your company. And that is going to result in an increase in supply and a rightward shift of the supply curve. Okay? So supply shocks are sort of this just like I said, drastic, out of the ordinary events that occur in the economy. And sometimes they are, positive supply shocks are often called beneficial supply shocks. And negative supply shocks are, detrimental, I guess is the right word. Detrimental supply shocks. But it's one of the things that economists account for when dealing with supply and demand issues. Okay. All right. Let's move on to this last one. Taxes are a really easy one to explain. When I say taxes, I'm talking about business taxes. Businesses have to pay taxes on. Actually, they have to pay a lot of different kinds of taxes. Businesses have to pay employment taxes, meaning. Social Security, maybe you pay into Social Security at your job. Well, you only pay half of your Social Security. Your employer is required to pay the other half of your Social Security. There are other employment taxes too, like workers' compensation insurance. That's a requirement in a lot of places, in a lot of industries. So taxes, and then there's income taxes. When the business profits, the business has to pay out taxes, a proportion of their profits to the government. And so taxes are basically a cost. So an increase in any kind of taxes or a net increase in taxes basically makes it more expensive to do business. So that's an increase in production costs, which results in a decrease in supply. And then a decrease in taxes, meaning if some of your taxes went up and some of your taxes went down, but overall your taxes went down. So a decrease in taxes results in a decrease in your production costs. And when your costs of production go down, you are loving life. That means that you will have an increase in supply. Why? Because you can make more stuff. Why? Because you have more money, because you're keeping more of your money. Okay? Well, that's pretty much it. That's everything having to do with the determinants of supply. It is important for you to understand these determinants of supply. It's also important for you to understand the determinants of demand. And what we're going to do is in the next lesson, we're going to bring these determinants of supply and demand together and understand how a market for a product is a very dynamic thing as your supply curve and your demand curve are moving, left and right, right and left. Okay? All right, well, that's all I have to say about the determinants of supply and demand. Let me know if you have any questions.